In the fall of 1818, a 9-year-old boy in the Indiana wilderness watched his mother die over the course of 7 agonizing days. She was vomiting, trembling, unable to keep down water. There was nothing anyone in that settlement could do about it. Her breath had already taken on the sickly sweet, almost metallic smell that neighbors would later describe as the surest sign of the disease, the one detail everyone in that part of the frontier learned to dread. The boy's name was Abraham Lincoln. His mother's name was Nancy Hanks Lincoln. And the thing that killed her was milk. Not spoiled milk, not milk gone bad in the summer heat. Ordinary, fresh, otherwise unremarkable milk from a cow that had eaten the wrong plant in the woods. Nobody in that settlement knew that yet. They just knew that people were dying, one household at a time, and the disease seemed to follow no pattern except that it came after drinking milk. They called it the milk sick, and in some counties it killed more people than cholera. That's the substance you were probably given as a toddler in a cup with a cartoon on it. Today it's treated as one of the safest, most wholesome things in the entire supermarket. For most of human history, in a lot of places, that was not remotely true. To understand how something this basic became this dangerous, you have to go back much further than Indiana in 1818. You have to go back to a moment when humans couldn't drink milk at all. Roughly 10,000 years ago, in what's now Turkey and the surrounding region, humans began domesticating cattle, sheep, and goats. What almost nobody realizes is that almost none of those early farmers could actually digest milk as adults. The enzyme that breaks down lactose, the sugar in milk, switches off in most mammals after infancy. That's true for basically every species on Earth, humans included for most of our history. Drinking milk as a grown adult should have meant bloating, cramping, and diarrhea. The same reaction a large percentage of the world's population still has today. Then something strange happened, genetically speaking. A mutation appeared, probably in a population somewhere in Central Europe, around 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, that kept the lactase enzyme switched on into adulthood. People with that mutation could drink milk their entire lives without getting sick. And because milk was an extraordinary calorie source in a world where famine was the default condition of human life, that mutation spread through populations at a speed that geneticists still find remarkable. It's one of the fastest cases of natural selection ever documented in humans. A single genetic accident turned milk from something only babies could handle into an adult food source that reshaped entire economies. What nobody expects, though, is that this mutation never spread everywhere. Today, an estimated 65% of adults worldwide still can't fully digest lactose. Most of East Asia, most of West Africa, most of indigenous populations in the Americas. Lactose tolerance isn't the human default. It's a regional adaptation that happened to take over in Europe and parts of Africa in the Middle East, and then got exported everywhere else through colonization and trade. The entire dairy industry, the cheese, the yogurt, the glass of milk beside your cereal, exists because of a genetic fluke that only some of your ancestors happened to carry. If you've ever felt slightly off after a bowl of cereal and never quite figured out why, there's a real chance your body is just doing exactly what it evolved to do. Roughly 68% of the global population has some degree of lactose malabsorption. Among people of East Asian descent, that number climbs to around 90%. Among people of Northern European descent, it drops below 20%. Also, that's not a disorder. It's the ordinary, expected biology of most of the human species. The unusual ones, biologically speaking, are the people who can drink a glass of milk at 40 and feel completely fine. Once humans could digest it, milk became something close to sacred. In ancient Mesopotamia, temple reliefs show priestesses milking cattle as a religious act. and the Sumerians tracked dairy production in cuneiform tablets alongside grain and gold. In the Hebrew Bible, the phrase, "a land flowing with milk and honey," isn't poetic exaggeration. It's the highest possible description of abundance a Bronze Age society could imagine. In ancient Egypt, milk crossed over from nutrition into medicine and vanity combined. Egyptian physicians prescribed milk baths for skin ailments centuries before Cleopatra supposedly made the practice famous. And donkey's milk was considered so valuable for the complexion that Roman writers claim wealthy households traveled with entire herds just to keep a fresh bath on hand. The Mongols pushed this even further. Fermented mare's milk, called arog, was the backbone of the entire steppe economy, giving Genghis Khan's armies a calorie-dense food source straight from the same horses they rode into battle. An empire stretching from Korea to Hungary was partly fueled by fermented horse milk. Somewhere in the ancient Near East, a herder almost certainly stored milk in a container made from a slaughtered animal's stomach, the way people commonly carried liquids before pottery and glass existed. The stomach lining held an enzyme called rennet, and that enzyme curdled the milk into solid curds and liquid whey. The herder, presumably expecting spoiled milk, discovered something entirely new instead. A solid, dense food that kept far longer than milk ever could. Cheese wasn't invented in a kitchen. It was discovered by accident, inside a dead animal's stomach. That accident solved milk's oldest problem. Milk spoils within a day or two. Cheese, properly aged, can last for years. Alpine cheese wheels became currency-adjacent objects used to pay rent and settle debts for centuries. And medieval monasteries developed some of the most sophisticated aging techniques of the entire pre-modern world just to keep protein on hand through long winters. Ancient Greeks even believed the Milky Way itself was breast milk, spilled across the night sky by the goddess Hera. That's how powerful this substance felt to people who depended on it for survival. For most of human history, though, milk had one enormous problem, and it's the same problem that would eventually kill Lincoln's mother thousands of years later. Milk spoils fast, and it can carry things that kill you. For most of that history, nobody could tell the difference between milk that would nourish you and milk that would put you in the ground. Ask yourself something. How would you know, standing in a market with no refrigeration and no lab, whether the milk in front of you was safe? For most of human history, you simply couldn't. You drank it and you hoped. This is where the story turns genuinely dark, and it turns dark specifically in the places you'd least expect it. Not in some remote village, in the biggest, wealthiest cities on Earth. By the 1850s, New York City was one of the fastest growing cities in the world, and its poorest residents needed cheap milk for their children. Distillers making whiskey in Manhattan and Brooklyn had a byproduct problem. Mountains of hot, wet grain mash left over from fermentation. Someone figured out you could feed that mash directly to cows, stabled right next to the distillery, and those cows would produce enormous quantities of milk at almost no cost. The milk itself was thin, bluish, and nearly worthless nutritionally, so the dairies doctored it, plaster of Paris to whiten it, starch and eggs to thicken it, molasses to warm its color. They called it pure country milk and sold it door to door in the poorest tenement districts of the city, sometimes for as little as 6 cents a quart. Mothers lined up every morning believing they were buying the healthiest thing their child could drink. The cows themselves were kept in conditions that read like something out of a horror account, packed into filthy stalls, standing in their own manure, covered in sores, their teeth rotting from the constant hot mash. Some were too weak to stand and had to be suspended in slings just to keep them upright long enough to be milked again. Flies covering their open wounds while the milk ran out, thin and faintly blue. In 1858, a journalist named Frank Leslie sent reporters and illustrators to document what was actually happening inside these distillery dairies. His team snuck into the stables at night, sketching the diseased cattle and interviewing the workers who tended them, since the dairy owners refused any official access. What they published week after week in Leslie's illustrated newspaper caused outrage across the entire city. The New York Times ran an estimate that has haunted historians ever since. Roughly 8,000 infants a year were dying from swill milk. Not 8,000 total, 8,000 a year in one city. Many of those children would be dead before the week was over. This should make you angry in exactly the way it made 1858 New Yorkers angry. When the city finally convened a Board of Health investigation, the man put in charge of it was a Tammany Hall alderman, nicknamed Butcher Mike, who spent the hearings defending the distillers and arguing, with a straight face, that swill milk was actually healthier for children than ordinary milk. The investigation exonerated the dairies. It took until 1862, 4 years after the exposé, for New York to pass its first real milk regulations. Thousands of children had already died waiting for that law. Swill milk wasn't an isolated horror story confined to one decade in one city. It was a preview of a problem that would keep recurring for the next 100 years, because the underlying issue never went away. Nobody had figured out how to make milk safe. Meanwhile, out in the American countryside, a completely different kind of milk poisoning was unfolding. The one that reached all the way into Lincoln's childhood. Milk sickness, the disease that killed Nancy Hanks Lincoln, came from a plant called white snake root, which grows wild across the American Midwest. Cattle that grazed in the woods, especially during dry seasons when open pasture ran short, would eat the plant and pass its toxin, called trimetol, directly into their milk. Nobody connected the dots at the time. Families would drink perfectly normal-looking milk from their own cow and start trembling, vomiting, unable to hold anything down, and within days, some of them would be dead. It killed so many people across Kentucky, Indiana, and Ohio in the early 1800s that entire communities abandoned their settlements and moved west, believing the land itself was somehow cursed. It wasn't the land. It was what the cows were eating in the woods surrounding it. The person who eventually solved this mystery wasn't a university-trained physician. It was a frontier woman named Anna Pierce Hobbs Bixby, working alone in the same wooded counties where the disease kept returning every dry summer. She spent seasons quietly tracking which pastures made cattle sick and which didn't. According to the most widely repeated account of the story, an elderly Shawnee woman she'd befriended finally told her which plant to look for in the underbrush. Bixby tested the theory herself. She fed the plant to a calf and watched it die of the same trembling, vomiting symptoms she'd seen kill her own neighbors. Then she worked to get the plant eradicated from her community's grazing land. She received essentially no recognition from the medical establishment during her lifetime, and the disease she helped identify wasn't formally confirmed by mainstream medicine until 1928, more than a century after it took Lincoln's mother. You're probably starting to notice a pattern here. Milk has spent most of its history being one of the most dangerous things a person could put in their body, not because milk itself is inherently bad, but because nobody had any reliable way to know what was actually in it or what the animal producing it had been eating until it was too late. There's one striking exception to that pattern, and it comes from wartime Britain. During the Second World War, with food supplies stretched to their absolute limit under German naval blockade, the British government made a deliberate policy decision that milk would be one of the few items protected from the worst of rationing, specifically for children and pregnant women. Every child under 5 was guaranteed a daily allocation of milk, and school-aged children received it free through a program that would later be known simply as school milk. Nutritionists advising the wartime government had concluded that of everything in short supply, milk mattered too much to childhood development to risk cutting it, even while adults went without butter, meat, and sugar for years at a stretch. Britain came out of 6 years of brutal rationing with childhood health statistics that, by some measures, actually improved compared to the pre-war years. For once in this story, a government looked at milk, understood exactly how much power it held over child survival, and used that power deliberately for the better instead of exploiting it or ignoring it. Before anyone solved that problem scientifically, one man tried to solve it mechanically, and his motivation was almost embarrassingly personal. Gale Borden was a Texas newspaperman and inventor who, in 1851, watched several infants die aboard a ship during a rough Atlantic crossing because the ship's dairy cows had gotten seasick and stopped producing usable milk. Borden became fixated on preserving milk the way meat and vegetables were being canned around the same period. After years of failed experiments, he patented a vacuum evaporation process that removed most of the water from milk and sealed the concentrated result in airtight cans, creating what we now call condensed milk. It didn't need refrigeration. It didn't spoil for months. During the Civil War, the Union Army placed massive orders for Borden's condensed milk to feed soldiers in the field, and the product's reputation as a safe, reliable food source for children exploded in the decades that followed. Borden hadn't cured milk sickness or swill milk, but he'd proven, years before anyone fully understood the microbiology involved, that milk could be made stable through nothing more than heat, a vacuum seal, and a tin can. The man who finally broke this pattern wasn't trying to save milk at all. He was trying to save French wine. In the 1860s, Louis Pasteur was asked by the French wine industry to figure out why so many batches of wine were spoiling. Through careful experimentation, he discovered that heating a liquid to a specific temperature for a specific length of time killed the microorganisms responsible for spoilage, without ruining the product itself. He called the process, modestly after himself, pasteurization. Pasteur wasn't thinking about milk when he developed this, but within a few decades, scientists and public health reformers realized his discovery could solve one of the deadliest problems in modern cities. Unpasteurized milk was a major vector for tuberculosis, typhoid fever, diphtheria, and a long list of other diseases devastating infant populations across Europe and America. Bovine tuberculosis alone, transmitted through raw milk, is estimated to have killed tens of thousands of children annually in major cities before pasteurization became standard practice. The rollout wasn't instant, and it wasn't universal. Dairy interests in several American cities actively fought pasteurization requirements, arguing the process was unnecessary, expensive, and ruined the taste. Nathan Strauss, a wealthy New York philanthropist who had lost a child to what he believed was contaminated milk, spent his own fortune building pasteurization depots across the city and distributing safe milk to poor families for free. Infant mortality rates in cities that adopted mandatory pasteurization dropped by measurable, dramatic margins within a single generation. A laboratory discovery developed to save wine ended up saving more children's lives than almost any single public health measure of the entire 19th century. Making milk safe didn't end the fight over it. It just moved the battlefield from the nursery to the farm. By the early 1930s, with the Great Depression crushing prices, a handful of massive dairy companies, including Borden itself, effectively controlled the milk supply for millions of New Yorkers through tight contracts with distributor cooperatives. Independent farmers, squeezed to the point where they were being paid less for their milk than it cost to produce it, started dumping it directly into roadside ditches rather than sell at a loss. Convoys of milk trucks were blocked, picketed, and in some documented cases physically attacked by striking farmers trying to force prices back up. The unrest got serious enough that New York passed a state law fixing minimum milk prices, a law dairy distributors challenged all the way to the Supreme Court, arguing the government had no business setting the price of milk. In 1934, in a case called Nebbia versus New York, The court disagreed, ruling that milk was essential enough to public health and welfare that the state could regulate its price like almost nothing else in the American economy. A glass of milk had just become important enough to reshape constitutional law. You'd think that would be the end of milk killing infants. It wasn't. It just moved to a different product, in a different part of the world a century later. Long before formula existed, wealthy families across ancient Rome, medieval Europe, and colonial America solved the problem of infant feeding a different way, by paying another woman to breastfeed their child for them. Wet nursing was a genuine profession, sometimes respected, sometimes brutal, especially in foundling hospitals where overworked wet nurses were assigned far more infants than they could properly feed. By the late 1800s, as formula became commercially available, it was marketed as the modern, hygienic alternative to all of that uncertainty. For families with clean water and refrigeration, it often was exactly that. The problem started when the same pitch got exported to places that had neither. By the 1970s, birth rates in wealthy countries were falling, and infant formula companies needed a new market. Nestlé, among others, began aggressively marketing formula across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, sometimes using sales representatives dressed in nurses' uniforms to lend the product false medical authority inside maternity wards, handing out free samples to new mothers just long enough for their own breast milk to dry up before the free supply ran out. Formula has to be mixed with water, and in many of the communities being targeted, clean water simply wasn't available. Desperately poor mothers trying to stretch an expensive product further would also frequently overdilute it. The result, according to public health researchers who studied the crisis, was a wave of malnutrition and diarrheal disease that one economic analysis estimated caused over 200,000 infant deaths a year at the peak of the controversy. A 1974 report titled, bluntly, "The Baby Killer," triggered an international boycott that lasted years and eventually forced the World Health Organization to adopt formal international marketing codes in 1981. The same basic mechanism that killed thousands of children in 1850s New York had simply repeated itself on a global scale, 100 years and an ocean away. By the mid-20th century, milk had completed one of the strangest reputational journeys of any food in human history. From a substance that killed thousands of infants a year in American cities, to the single most aggressively marketed perfect food of the modern era. Got milk, the gold standard of the American school lunch tray, milk mustaches on movie stars. This wasn't the dairy industry's first time using government power to protect itself either. Back in the 1870s, when margarine hit the American market as a cheap butter substitute, the dairy lobby didn't just complain, they got laws passed. By the early 1900s, several states required margarine to be dyed an unappetizing pink specifically so it couldn't be mistaken for butter, and manufacturers eventually got around it by selling plain white margarine with a small capsule of yellow dye, so customers could color it themselves at the kitchen table. It took until 1950 for Congress to repeal the federal tax punishing colored margarine. A full industry, built entirely around not looking like butter, existed for decades because the dairy lobby had enough political muscle to legislate the color of your toast. What most people never learn is that the Got Milk campaign wasn't organic public enthusiasm for dairy either. By the late 1980s, milk consumption had been declining for years, so Congress created a mandatory fee, taken from every dairy farmer, whether they liked it or not, and used it to fund Got Milk and get milk cartons required on every school lunch tray in America. A few farmers sued, arguing the government shouldn't be allowed to force them to pay for advertising. The Supreme Court sided with the government in 2005. The most wholesome-looking ad campaign of the decade was, underneath everything, a government-enforced tax convincing you to keep buying a product regional biology never fully equipped most of the human species to digest. And this is where the story does something you probably didn't see coming, because the argument over milk safety never actually ended. It just changed shape and moved into the present day. Right now in 2026, there is an active and genuinely contested movement in the United States pushing for wider legal access to raw, unpasteurized milk. Advocates argue it retains beneficial enzymes and bacteria that pasteurization destroys, and that adults should have the right to choose their own food risks. In states where selling raw milk directly is still illegal, some farms have set up cow share programs instead, where customers technically buy partial ownership of a cow and simply collect their share of its milk, a legal workaround that sidesteps the sales ban entirely. Public health researchers point to CDC data showing that between 1998 and 2018 alone, raw milk was linked to over 200 documented outbreaks in the United States, resulting in thousands of illnesses and hundreds of hospitalizations, along with cases of kidney failure in children caused by E. coli contamination. Both sides of that debate exist right now, actively in state legislatures across the country, with some states loosening restrictions even as federal health agencies continue warning against them. This isn't a settled historical question, it's a live one, and reasonable people land on different sides of it depending on how they weigh individual choice against documented risk. And that's not even the strangest part of where this story ends up. The technology came from two vegan bioengineers who, by their own account, just missed real cheese and couldn't find a plant-based version that tasted right. In 2014, they took the actual genetic sequence for milk protein, mapped from a cow's genome, and inserted it directly into yeast, the same organism used to brew beer. The yeast, fermenting in a tank, produces real milk protein, molecule for molecule identical to what comes out of a cow, without a single animal anywhere in the process. The technique is called precision fermentation, and companies using it have already gotten regulatory approval in the United States to sell whey protein and eventually kekisen made entirely this way. Independent life cycle studies suggest the process can cut water use by up to 99% and greenhouse emissions by up to 97% compared to a dairy cow doing the same job. One facility currently under construction is designed to produce dairy protein at a volume equivalent to 50,000 cows a year without raising a single one. It's already showing up quietly in ice cream and protein powder on store shelves, usually without most customers ever noticing the milk in the product never came from an animal. Think about the full distance this story travels. A random mutation lets some ancient humans drink milk into adulthood, and it's spread through our species faster than almost any other trait we carry. A frontier woman with no formal training figured out it was silently killing families in the Indiana woods, decades before medicine caught up to her. A journalist in 1858 exposed thousands of dead infants in the wealthiest city in America, and the men in charge of investigating it laughed the case out of the room. A scientist trying to save French wine accidentally saved more children's lives than almost anyone else in the 19th century. Farmers dumped milk into ditches and fought police over its price until the Supreme Court itself had to decide what a glass of milk was worth. 100 years after Lincoln's mother died, in different countries, the exact same mistake played out again with baby formula. And somewhere in between all of that, a government spent decades legislating what color your toast spread was allowed to be. For 10,000 years, humanity has been trying to make milk safe. Today, we figured out how to make it without the cow at all. That's not a simple story about a wholesome white liquid in your refrigerator. It never was. This has been the hungry past. If this one changed how you'll look at your next glass of milk, hit subscribe, because there's more of this coming. Drop a comment and tell us which part got you the most. Was it Lincoln's mother? Was it 8,000 dead infants in one city in one year? Or was it the fact that most of the adult human race still can't actually digest the stuff we've spent 10,000 years building entire civilizations around? Let us know below.